November 14th, 1944. Northern France. The air was brittle sharp and carried the lingering scent of smoke from distant artillery. A thin frost glazed the uneven earth, turning the temporary POW camp into a fragile mirror of ice and mud, each footprint a fleeting mark of human struggle. Grey mist hovered low over the ground, blending sky and horizon into a cold, indistinct grey, while the brittle branches of nearby trees scraped softly against one another in the faint wind. German women, worn to the edge of exhaustion, shuffled through the muddy paths, their uniforms torn, dirt-streaked, and ill-fitting, revealing the months of hardship etched into every motion. Their faces, pale and hollowed by hunger, betrayed a mixture of fear, confusion, and disbelief as the camp guards barked terse orders that seemed almost cruel in their simplicity. From the distant forest came the faint echo of distant gunfire, a grim reminder that the war had not paused for anyone, especially not for these women. The camp smelled of smoke, damp wool, and unwashed bodies, a harsh blend that clung to everything in the freezing air. Some huddled in corners, trying to keep warmth in their trembling limbs. Others stared blankly at the ground, waiting for the next command, any command that might signal what was expected of them next. And then came the order, simple yet utterly bewildering: kneel down. In that moment, confusion rippled through the rows of women. Their minds raced, trying to grasp whether it was a test, a ritual, or a cruel joke. The tension hung heavy, thick as the frost in the air, as every eye flicked toward the guards. Searching for explanation, the command to kneel had barely left the lips of the guards when a ripple of uncertainty spread through the women. They were thin, haggard, shadows of their former selves, and yet something instinctual stirred inside. A flicker of resistance, a fleeting doubt about whether this demand was to be obeyed or ignored. Some bent their knees slightly, half expecting the order to vanish, as if disbelief could erase the moment. The cold bit through their clothes, sharp against exposed skin, and the frost beneath their boots crunched with an almost accusatory clarity, amplifying the silence that followed the command. A woman with dark, stringy hair tied loosely at the nape of her neck pressed her hands to her chest, her fingers trembling as she looked from one comrade to another, searching for reassurance in faces that reflected the same confusion and fear. The scent of smoke and wet earth mingled with the acrid odor of sweat and unwashed uniforms, creating an atmosphere heavy with both physical discomfort and psychological tension. In the distance, the occasional clatter of boots on frozen mud, or the faint, muffled orders of guards echoed, emphasizing the rigid hierarchy that governed every second of their existence. Each of the women felt it, the immense, oppressive weight of being observed, the unspoken consequences of defiance hovering invisibly like a specter in the cold air. The command was so simple, so absolute, and yet it carried with it a violent ambiguity. Kneel down. The words were a physical force in themselves, tugging at the edges of understanding, demanding compliance without explanation, stripping the prisoners of agency in a single syllable. Some of the women hesitated longer than others, their knees brushing the frozen earth tentatively, testing the ground as if it might swallow them whole, as if the soil itself held the answer to the incomprehensible demand. Their boots sank slightly into the mud, sticky and unwilling, dragging behind them the sounds of reluctant submission. One young woman, barely 19, froze completely. Her wide, frightened eyes darted from the looming shadows of the guards to the anxious, fatigued faces of her fellow prisoners. Each breath came visible in the icy air, sharp and ragged, condensing into thin clouds that vanished almost instantly. The cold seemed to bite at her lungs, tightening the chest with every inhalation. Yet she could not move forward. She could not kneel. Something deep within screamed that to obey this command would be to acknowledge a submission that went beyond the ordinary hardships of camp life. Around her, others began to bend their knees, hands brushing the frost-laden ground as if touching it could anchor them to reality, a reality that had become incomprehensible in its arbitrariness. The ground was damp and uneven, a mixture of mud, ice, and scattered leaves, and each woman's uniform was smeared with streaks of brown from the frozen soil. The sensation of kneeling against the cold earth sent shivers up their spines, a mixture of physical discomfort and the humiliating weight of obedience. The frost clung to the edges of their coats and the collars of their shirts. Crystals glittering faintly under the pale washed out light filtering through the mist. A low murmur rose among the prisoners, almost instinctual, a whispered questioning that neither challenged nor confronted, but sought solidarity in shared incomprehension. The guards did not speak beyond the initial command. Their hands rested casually on their belts or rifles, yet the air around them pulsed with authority, invisible but unmistakable. Every movement of the women was scrutinized, measured and catalogued, and in their hesitation lay both fear and subtle defiance. One older woman, her face lined with exhaustion and months of hunger, lowered herself slowly, deliberately, as if testing not only the ground, but the very bounds of human dignity. Her fingers pressed into the frozen mud, leaving faint impressions that would vanish under the next passing step. But for her, the act was a careful negotiation between obedience and self-preservation. As they knelt, the women's thoughts swirled with memories of their homes, of families, of moments long past that now seemed almost unreal. Each mind tried to anchor itself to fragments of normalcy, the smell of bread baking in a German village kitchen, the sound of laughter echoing in a courtyard, the warmth of a fire in winter. Yet here, in this frozen clearing, those memories felt distant, almost foreign, against the stark immediacy of the command. They were prisoners of war in every sense, body, mind, and spirit. But this moment, this act of kneeling, introduced a new layer of vulnerability, one that no rationed meal or physical hardship had ever demanded. Kneeling, they realized, was not just a physical act. It was a surrender of expectation, a tangible recognition of the control imposed over their existence, the arbitrary assertion of authority that could bend even the strongest will. The cold mud seeped through layers of clothing, soaking their knees, sticking to stockings and boots alike, reminding them that obedience often carried a price measured not in words, but in discomfort, humiliation, and the subtle erosion of selfhood. The frost-laden wind carried with it faint sounds of distant artillery and the quiet, almost imperceptible rustling of the forest beyond the camp. It seemed to mock them, a reminder of a world moving relentlessly onward, indifferent to their suffering or confusion. The women remained kneeling, some with eyes lowered, others lifting their gaze to meet the uncertain expressions of their companions. In these glances, small, silent stories unfolded, disbelief, resignation, anger, fear, and an instinctive search for solidarity. Even in such a moment of submission, subtle forms of communication passed between them, a fleeting touch of a hand, a shared shiver, or the barely perceptible nod of acknowledgement. The act of kneeling had transformed the clearing into a stage of tension, where every gesture, every breath, and every motion was weighted with meaning beyond the surface of the command. It was in these fleeting, fraught interactions that the human story of endurance, bewilderment, and fragile courage became most vividly apparent. Time seemed to stretch unnaturally. What should have been a brief moment became an eternal tableau of uncertainty as the women waited, knelt, and tried to decipher the invisible rules governing their lives. Their minds, tired and hungry, raced with every possible interpretation, with every imagined consequence of defiance or compliance. The cold air burned their lungs with each breath, crystallizing the sense of isolation and exposure. Mud clung to their knees, mixing with the dirt streaking their faces, as though the earth itself was unwilling to let go of them. Yet beneath this discomfort, beneath the weight of authority pressing invisibly on their spines, something stubbornly human persisted, a refusal to fully surrender their identity, a fragile resilience that whispered through shivers and subtle glances. The command had been given, and they had obeyed. But even obedience could not fully extinguish the bewilderment and quiet resistance simmering in their minds. The cold did not relent, and neither did the tension. As the women knelt in the frost-bitten mud, the guards circled slowly, their boots crunching sharply against frozen earth, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the suffocating silence. Each step was deliberate, calculated, a rhythm meant to remind the prisoners of the absolute authority they were under. The air was brittle, carrying the faint, acrid smell of smoke from a distant fire mingled with the earthy rot of frost, damp soil. The women could feel the weight of observation pressing down, every subtle movement scrutinized, every hesitation noted. Some of the younger prisoners clasped their hands tightly in their laps, knuckles white, trying to calm the tremor that ran through their bodies. The older women, though similarly frail, maintained a measured composure, leaning forward slightly, hands pressing harder into the mud, testing its icy texture as if drawing strength from the earth itself. Their breaths were visible, short and ragged clouds that faded quickly in the cold air, carrying the sound of life fragile and tense. One guard, tall and stern, stopped behind a woman with wide, frightened eyes. She flinched instinctively, shoulders rising as if to protect herself, but did not move. Her mind raced, trying to decode the meaning of this command. Was it a test of loyalty, a demonstration of control? The uncertainty gnawed at her, sharper than any hunger or cold. The mud seeped into her stockings, clinging to the exposed skin at her knees, cold and wet. Yet she remained kneeling, understanding instinctively that hesitation could provoke punishment. Around her, the others mirrored her discomfort, stiff backs, tight fists, and subtle shivers that betrayed the tension beneath the surface. Each woman wrestled internally with the enormity of the command. Kneeling had become more than a physical act. It was a mental struggle, a confrontation with authority that left no room for doubt, yet demanded obedience. The camp was filled with small, unnerving sounds that seemed amplified in the frost, thick air. The distant crack of a branch underfoot, a faint cough from one of the prisoners, the low murmur of a guard speaking to another. These noises formed a fragile, tense soundtrack to the tableau unfolding. Every woman knelt, yet in her mind a storm raged, memories of home and past freedom colliding violently with the stark reality of their present. One young girl, barely able to hold herself upright, felt her mind drift, imagining the warm kitchens of her youth, the smell of bread, the laughter of family, yet the vision only intensified the bewilderment she felt. Her knees ached from the cold, her uniform stuck to her skin in uncomfortable patches, and still she could not find an explanation for the arbitrary command. A low wind swept through the clearing, tugging at the women's hair and the edges of their ragged coats. The mist thickened, curling around shoulders, hair, and the mud-streaked faces of the prisoners, blurring the boundary between the earth and the sky. It was as if the world itself held its breath, waiting for some invisible resolution that refused to come. One prisoner tilted her head slightly, trying to glimpse the expressions of the guards, searching for a hint of reason, an indication that this strange demand had meaning beyond humiliation. But the guards remained impassive, their faces fixed, eyes calculating, a wall of authority that brooked no argument. The tension escalated when a second command arrived, terse and deliberate, breaking the fragile rhythm of the clearing. "Lower your heads." Murmurs rippled among the prisoners, though no words were spoken aloud. Some bowed instinctively, their foreheads pressing against frozen mud, tasting the earthy grit, feeling the sting of cold pressed into the skin. Others hesitated, fear warring with instinct, their shoulders stiff, eyes darting sideways, to see what fate awaited the women who dared to linger. The sensation of kneeling and lowering their heads was almost unbearable. The cold seeped into every joint, every muscle, and the psychological weight of submission pressed down like a stone. Each second stretched interminably, their minds mapping the possible consequences of disobedience, trying to understand whether this strange exercise had a purpose beyond the assertion of dominance. Among the group, a middle-aged woman, her hair streaked with grey and face lined by months of fatigue, lifted her eyes briefly to those around her. The look she exchanged with a younger girl conveyed something unspoken: bewilderment, solidarity, a shared confusion that required no words. In that fleeting communication lay both fear and defiance, subtle and quiet, a recognition that obedience could coexist with human dignity even in the face of humiliation. The cold mud clung to the prisoners' knees as they shifted slightly, readjusting, finding small comforts wherever they could. The smell of wet earth, sweat, and smoke became an almost tangible presence, weighing on them as much as the frost. Every detail, the crunch of boots, the faint click of rifle bolts, the hushed rustle of clothing, was etched into memory, a sensory record of a moment that balanced precariously between submission and revolt. Some of the prisoners closed their eyes, trying to find a place inside their minds that remained untouched by the absurdity of the command. Others stared straight ahead, unblinking, as if defiance could be maintained simply by holding their gaze. The camp's makeshift barracks loomed in the distance, wooden structures dark and imposing, shadows stretching across the frost-laden ground. The prisoners' knees pressed into mud that was slowly softening with the day's slight thaw, a reminder that even in the midst of rigid discipline, the environment shifted, impermanent, indifferent to their suffering. The tension was heightened further by the subtle hierarchy among the prisoners themselves. Older women subtly encouraged the younger ones, nudging them to kneel properly, offering faint reassurances through gesture rather than words. The younger girls, in turn, mirrored movements instinctively, trying to imitate a composure they did not yet feel. The interplay of fear, confusion, solidarity, and resignation created a dynamic almost imperceptible to the guards, yet intensely felt among the prisoners themselves. Each micro-interaction became a narrative of human endurance, a silent testament to the will to survive amid arbitrary cruelty. Time became an elastic, almost unbearable force. Minutes stretched, punctuated only by the guards' measured steps, the occasional shiver, the friction of clothing against skin, and the steady, unrelenting frost that gnawed at the body. The psychological pressure mounted as each woman realized that obedience was not a guarantee of mercy, that the act of kneeling and bowing did not shield them from arbitrary punishment, nor did it guarantee understanding. Yet, in a strange, fragile way, the act united them, a shared ordeal that bound each individual to the others through silent recognition of the absurdity, the cold, and the constant fear. By the time the guards began to move on, circling the clearing in a slow, methodical inspection, the women were knelt in precise lines, shoulders tense, faces pale, eyes wide, mud smeared on their knees and streaking their uniforms. The frost had started to melt slightly under the weak light of the winter morning, but the physical and psychological weight of the command remained, lingering in the air like a stubborn fog. Even as the sound of boots receded into the distance, the prisoners could feel the invisible imprint of authority pressing down, the strange, bewildering weight of compliance, and the quiet hum of defiance simmering beneath the surface. In these moments, the women's understanding of control, obedience, and submission was reshaped. The command, simple yet bewildering, had become a defining exercise of human endurance, a moment that would linger in memory long after the frost melted and the mud dried. Kneeling, they had discovered the delicate interplay of fear and resilience, humiliation and solidarity, and the strange dignity that could persist even in the face of arbitrary authority. The morning wore on, pale sunlight struggling to cut through the dense mist that clung stubbornly to the camp. The women remained kneeling, their knees stiff, frozen mud melting slowly beneath their weight, soaking through threadbare uniforms. Each breath drew in the cold, sharp air, carrying with it the scent of earth, smoke and sweat. Time had become both relentless and stagnant, stretching impossibly as the prisoners waited for the next move, their bodies rigid with tension, muscles cramping, yet unwilling to flinch under the watchful eyes of the guards. Their faces, streaked with frost and dirt, reflected the bewilderment that had first gripped them at the command to kneel. Some tried to steel themselves, forcing their gazes downward to the mud beneath them. Others lifted trembling eyes to their comrades, seeking reassurance, solidarity, some shared understanding in a moment that defied comprehension. The guards moved with deliberate pace, boots sinking into the half-thawed mud, the rhythm of each step emphasizing the absolute control they wielded. One of the women, her dark hair plastered against her pale cheeks, shifted slightly, trying to relieve the pins and needles sensation in her knees. A sharp glance from a nearby guard halted the motion immediately, and she froze again, pressing herself tighter to the cold earth. Around her, the other prisoners mirrored the same fear, driven stillness, aware that any movement not explicitly sanctioned could provoke harsh reprisal. The tension in the clearing was nearly palpable, a weight pressing down as heavily as the frost clinging to their clothing. The simple act of kneeling, once an incomprehensible command, had evolved into a test of endurance, a crucible in which both the body and mind were stretched to their limits. Suddenly, the commanding officer's voice cut through the silence, crisp, authoritative, echoing across the frost-bitten clearing. "Raise your heads. Look forward." The words, so simple, carried the power to unravel months of weariness and confusion, and yet they arrived without explanation. The women lifted their heads cautiously, eyes wide and uncertain, scanning the faces of the guards, searching for a clue, an understanding of why such an arbitrary, humiliating act had been demanded of them. Their throats were dry, stomachs aching from hunger, limbs numb from prolonged kneeling, yet the command compelled attention. One young woman's knees were scraped and bleeding, mud hardened into tiny crusts against the raw skin, yet she did not move beyond what had been commanded. Her hands, still pressing into the frozen earth, betrayed subtle tremors, the result of both physical strain and mental fatigue. A silence followed the officer's command, heavier this time, loaded with expectation. The women exchanged nervous glances, subtle movements communicating what words could not: confusion, anxiety, and a tentative courage. They had obeyed without question, yet the inexplicable nature of the command left their minds churning. What did it mean? Was it merely a show of power, an exercise in obedience, or something else entirely? The ambiguity weighed on them, gnawed at their reason, and forced them to confront the fragility of control in this strange, liminal space where authority and survival intertwined. One of the older women, face lined and haggard, leaned forward slightly, her palms pressed against the mud, observing the reaction of the younger prisoners. She had experienced much in her life, but this moment felt uniquely surreal. The blending of fear, fatigue, and bewilderment created a psychological fog that clung to the women more persistently than the frost clinging to their clothes. Around them, the camp was quiet except for the occasional distant sound of artillery, the faint rustle of fabric, and the whisper of breath mingling with mist. These sounds became magnified, turning every tiny noise into a signal, a potential omen of what might come next. As the morning sun struggled to pierce the mist, the women's attention was drawn to a subtle shift in the guards' behavior. A senior officer approached slowly, his boots sinking deep into the softened mud, the butt of his rifle dragging faintly along the ground. Each step reverberated through the clearing, punctuating the long, tense moment. The women's hearts raced with a mixture of fear and anticipation, unsure whether the officer's approach signaled punishment or release. The mud clung to their knees, cold and wet, a physical reminder of the prolonged submission they had endured, while the icy wind tugged at collars and hair, forcing shivers that were indistinguishable from the trembling caused by tension. The officer stopped in front of the prisoners, scanning their faces methodically, his eyes lingering on each in turn. The women held their gazes downward, yet the faintest glances betrayed their attempts to understand, to anticipate what would come next. After a tense pause, the officer barked a single word: "Rise." The simplicity of the command belied its weight. Slowly, carefully, the women began to lift themselves from the mud. Knees ached, joints protested, muscles cramped, yet the prisoners moved with deliberate caution, aware that even the slightest misstep could invite reprimand. They rose as one, a fragile line of exhausted, bewildered figures covered in mud and frost, their bodies marked by the ordeal they had just endured. The moment of rising carried with it an almost imperceptible shift in the air. The women straightened as best they could, pulling themselves into ragged semblances of posture, faces pale, hair matted and frozen. Some exchanged small, hesitant smiles, fleeting acknowledgments that they had endured and survived the incomprehensible demand. Others remained stoic, eyes reflecting disbelief and the lingering confusion of the act they had been compelled to perform. The officer's gaze swept over them one final time, noting the compliance, yet offering no words of explanation. The power dynamic remained, absolute yet silent, but the act had created something new within the prisoners, a quiet, shared recognition of endurance, resilience, and the strange human capacity to withstand bewildering authority. As the officer turned and walked away, the women remained standing for a few moments longer, digesting the ordeal. The frost had begun to melt slowly around their boots, leaving streaks of mud, a tangible trace of submission and survival. Each woman's mind processed the event differently. Some in silent anger, some in quiet disbelief, others in muted relief that the command had ended without punishment. The clearing, once a stage for the incomprehensible demand, now held echoes of human resilience, subtle gestures of solidarity, and the lingering tension of authority unspoken, but deeply felt. Even after the guards departed, the prisoners remained connected by the shared experience. The act of kneeling, of submitting to an arbitrary command, had left a mark beyond the physical discomfort. It had highlighted the powerlessness of their situation, yet also revealed the strength that persisted beneath fear and confusion. Conversations, though hushed, began to emerge among the women, whispers of support, mutual recognition, and quiet reflection on what had just transpired. Memories of that frozen, mud-streaked morning would remain etched in faces, hands, and bodies as vivid reminders of the complex interplay between authority, obedience, and human endurance. By midday, the women had returned to the routines of camp life, but the psychological impact of the morning's ordeal lingered. The strange command to kneel had introduced them to a new dimension of their captivity, one in which compliance was demanded not merely for survival, but as a demonstration of control that transcended logic. Even as they gathered water, tended to small chores, or huddled for warmth, the tableau of the frost-laden clearing remained in memory a powerful, bewildering, and strangely unifying experience. In the eyes of the prisoners, a quiet understanding emerged. Even in the most arbitrary and humiliating of acts, endurance could carve a fragile space for dignity and solidarity.